Hi everyone and welcome to Inside Out with me, Susan Madaris. We'll be talking about America's labor movement this week. It's widely believed that these are extremely hard times for labor and union across the country. A time of weakness, a time of vulnerability. But supporters say unions have always been the backbone of America's working class, but their powers have diminished in recent years and membership is at an all-time low.
Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker has been a vocal critic of unions ever since he took office and recently signed into law legislation that makes Wisconsin a right-to-work state. It's the 25th state in the nation with such a law, which effectively means that mandatory union membership and dues are banned at privately owned businesses. A move strongly opposed by unions and the White House, which say restricts workers' rights. To many conservatives, unions are a symbol of violence, strikes, socialist influence, voter intimidation, and general thuggery. But to others, it's their only hope of survival in a corporate, business-led economy. And did I mention, union members almost always vote Democrat. Wisconsin was the birthplace of unions, and Scott Walker is believed to be preparing to run for president in 2016, and is frequently heard hinting at what he would do if elected to the White House.
Why is Wisconsin so significant in the story of organized labor in America? And what, if anything, can labor do to revive itself? All that and more on this edition of Inside Out.
4 years ago, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's budget repair bill brought some 100,000 union workers and their supporters out to the streets surrounding the state capitol in Madison in a brutally cold February weather. Satellite protests also took place in other cities throughout the state. Back then, protesters believed Walker's bill would cripple the state's public sector unions. They were right. It did. The law, also called Act 10, was eventually passed, severely restricting the power of public employee unions to bargain collectively. These days, all that's left to negotiate is a base pay, and even that's up for debate. I was in Wisconsin reporting on the developments in 2011. It still wasn't clear how the standoff would affect the power of the unions and general public opinion towards GOP policies.
While Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker has seemingly been successful in increasing pressure on the other side, it still remains to be seen how the standoff will play out in the long run, not only for the state of Wisconsin and the governor himself, but for the United States as a whole and the Republican Party in general.
4 years on, the answers to those questions seem clear. Governor Walker's provisions have given public employees little reason to pay dues to a union or become a member of one, simply because many workers believe union powers have all but diminished. I'll talk more about that later on this show. But first, about the Act 10 law. It's now clear that it was just the beginning of a tighter grip on unions. With Walker's blessing, Wisconsin recently became the 25th state to pass a so-called right-to-work law, which bans workplaces that have voted to unionize from collecting mandatory dues to support their collective bargaining efforts, which basically, again, limits the power of unions and labor movements. While longtime union strongholds like Michigan and Indiana had also recently enacted right-to-work laws, it was Wisconsin's decision that made the headlines, more so than any of the other 24 states. Why?
The American Federation of State and Municipal County Employees was formed first in Madison, Wisconsin. So some people see it as symbolic of the birthplace of some of the workers' rights movements. And I think also that Scott Walker has been so brazen that it has angered people with the ways in which he talks about unions it's not even, it's clear that he is on the war path.
Stephanie Luce is professor of labor studies at the Joseph S. Murphy Institute for Worker Education at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. She received her MA in Industrial Relations from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She is the author of several books, the latest, Labor Movements, Global Perspectives. I asked her how Governor Walker managed to garner the support needed to pass the right-to-work law in Wisconsin.
So there's some level to which Scott Walker has been able to kind of wedge workers, pit them against one another and say, taxpayers, you're carrying the burden of this teacher's salary.
My next guest, Jonathan Tassini, is a strategist, organizer, activist, commentator, and writer. He is the author of The Audacity of Greed and ran for a seat in the House of Representatives in 2010. A former president of the National Writers Union, he's currently president of the Economic Future Group, a national consulting group, and writes frequently for a labor and economy blog named Working Life. I asked him to elaborate on the right-to-work law, which Republicans have vowed to pass in every state once they have a chance.
If a union represents a certain segment in the public or private sector, basically says you don't have to belong to that union and you don't have to pay dues. And if you have a problem, let's say a grievance, the union actually has to pursue that grievance for you and pay for all the costs of that, but you don't have to pay dues to account for that. And not only that, if a union is successfully bargaining a good contract with wages, benefits, even if you don't pay union dues, you benefit from that. You get the same rights and benefits that every dues-paying member does. And effectively what that does is it undermines unionism. It makes it difficult for unions to do just their job because, let's face it, things do cost money to get done. You need people to handle a grievance. You need skilled people to bargain a contract. All that requires some staffing. And if you have what I call free riders, it essentially means that there's a whole bunch of people not paying to support those activities. I think you have to understand that those right-to-work states have been around for a long time. Most of those states have been right-to-work states for a number of decades.
So while the term right-to-work implies freedom, what the legislation actually does is undermine worker pay, allowing non-union members to accrue benefits won by unions without paying union dues. Today, as union membership declines, some believe support for organized labor is also diminishing.
So if you go out in the street today and you ask the average young person who's in their 20s or 30s, what's a union? A lot of them have no idea what a union is because they've never been a part of the union. And many of their parents have not been part of unions. So when you're at less than 7% of the private sector workforce, which is the size of the labor movement today in the United States, most people have no idea what it's like to be in a union. So when they hear then that right-wing politicians and anti-union politicians say, oh my God, the reason you're losing your job and the reason we can't pay you is because of unions, then people respond in some gut, uninformed way. And then you build on top of that the anti-union consultants and the complete intense warfare almost at every workplace to prevent unions from coming in. If you join those two together, it's the reason you don't have unions, and it's the reason that people buy in to that concept of, hey, we don't need a union here.
We don't teach about them in school, or they may have a vision from the media that unions are thugs and bullies. We still have over 50%, about 54% of Americans think unions are good for workers, but that varies by age, and younger workers are less familiar with unions. Certainly unions have a lot to do to improve their image and to be more inclusive and work with younger workers, immigrant workers. But I think that, you can see the example of Walmart is a great example of a company that has, as a business strategy, keeping wages low and keeping turnover high, keeping workers without rights.
The Pew Research Center says that union membership in 2013 stood at only 11.3%, down from over 20% 30 years prior. The decline has been especially steep in the private sector, where union membership stands at 6.6%. In the 1950s, which many consider to be America's economic heyday, more than a third of all employed American adults belonged to a union. Today, only 14.5 million Americans are counted as union members. But it wasn't always this way.
The labor movement was quite strong after the turn of the 20th century. If you look at the beginning of the century, when there were sit-down strikes where unions, many of the most powerful unions, the mine workers, the steel workers, the auto workers, were formed out of great struggle, and actually people were killed on picket lines by goons and thugs that were hired by the companies to actually shoot them down. That was a time of great growth in the union movement. At the same time, one of the things that, and this is important for the future, the labor movement grew in some way just in the war era, the World War II era, because there was a deal made between the government, the employers, and unions, and said, look, if unions don't strike, we'll make sure that you have employment, that you'll get pensions, health care. And so one of the things that happens, the labor movement grew very rapidly because of that tripartite type deal that was made on the war, but it also did something that is very unusual in the Western world, which is it made health care and pensions dependent on companies. It's one reason we don't have a national health care plan in the United States, a real one like a single-payer Canadian style, is that health care was put over to employers to take care of, generally for many decades.
The growth of the union continued through the 1960s and 70s.
Around, the rise of Ronald Reagan, unions ran into a lot of roadblocks. And if you look at that period from about 1980, maybe even in the 70s when deregulation started, to now, that was a time that things were reversed. And a lot of that had to do with just pure, simple, outright anti-unionism. It wasn't that the companies loved unions before, but they accepted them as part of the deal. But particularly after the air traffic controllers were broken by Ronald Reagan, it was a signal that companies could do the same thing. And right around that time, a huge industry grew of anti-union consultants, and companies would hire sometimes these guys who are not very clever, but then whole companies grew around the idea of breaking unions, and it's now become a multi-billion-dollar industry.
The United States is unusual for industrialized countries that we've never had a labor political party, and in fact, many people have said that both the mainstream parties represent business interests. So unions have really been one of the only, or the main organizations workers have to represent their interests, either improving wages and working conditions or even just speaking for democratic rights in this society.
While the combination of hostile legislators, business-friendly policies, and a shifting economic landscape have effectively led the organized labor movement to where it is today, unions themselves are also to blame.
They, in some cases, were, they excluded workers of color, they excluded immigrants, they excluded women. Some unions failed to keep up with the changing labor market, some became bureaucratic and even corrupt. So unions certainly take some of the blame. But on the other hand, there are a lot of reasons why unions have lost power that are about a sustained, coordinated, aggressive attack by employers and politicians. Corporations in this country went after unions as one of the main ways to boost profits. They've worked with politicians to change the rules. If you just look at something like the discrepancy between free trade laws that let investors move jobs and money across borders very easily, contrast that to immigration law, which has tightened the borders for people. So you can see our laws favor business and disfavor workers and unions. So unions have lost power, in many ways, their numbers, their power, their political influence, and I think, for both internal and external reasons.
With all that's happened, are unions somewhat irrelevant in our society?
If you look today, even jobs that college graduates have, adjunct professors, or service sector, fast food workers, these are still dangerous jobs. You can slip on the grease in the fast food industry. You can get repetitive motion injuries in a white collar job. So there's many reasons why workers still need unions, and in fact, maybe more than ever, because we have so few avenues to actually improve wages and working conditions. About 50% of U.S. workers earn wages below a living wage. It's extraordinary. So if we can't win improvements through our legislative process, unions are really the best hope for most workers today.
On the other hand, some union leaders are notorious for abusing their powers, like by threatening violence to induce employers to hire only union workers and make their point clear that either you hire a union or pay a price. After much research and a lot of unanswered phone calls, I was finally introduced to a non-union worker in Philadelphia who agreed to talk to me on the phone only if I don't reveal his name. He told me that while he isn't interested in joining the union as a construction worker, he's always afraid of harassment from local union leaders. He calls himself anti-union.
I just think that as more and more Americans join their union and their money rolls in, union bosses just get richer and more corrupt. Sure, some might argue that their membership's down, but they still got a lot of power. Just look at the coal industry. These leaders don't feel sorry for the workers. They're not idiots. They don't look at workers like human beings. If they did, why would they harass the poor workers who can't pay their bills and union fees? For me, I don't want to join your stupid union. The ranks and files of the AFL and the CIO, for example, its president pocketed almost $2.4 million over the past 10 years. Yeah, it runs an organization, but so do all the Wall Street kingpins. $2.4 million was just his salary. I want people who support these thugs to open their eyes and know that. They're already becoming irrelevant anyways.
As the economic picture in America becomes more polarized in terms of inequality, it's a justifiable question whether or not the strength of organized labor is tied to the country's overall prosperity. While there seems to be a host of other factors to take into consideration, this chart from a 2012 press release from the Economic Policy Institute shows the wide gap between the decline of unions and shared prosperity. Also, an analysis published by the International Monetary Fund in March 2015 finds that the impact of declining unionization is felt across the entire income spectrum. The trend not only reduces the welfare of the lower income worker, it makes the rich richer.
It's just a fact that if you belong to a union, you make a better living. It's just a fact that if you belong to a union, you're more likely to have health care. You're more likely to have a decent pension. When you don't have a union, you don't have those benefits. And that translates out into the economy. Now, I'm always struck by all these supposedly smart people who talk about the problems they see in the economy, that we're not seeing real growth, that we're not seeing a sustained economic boom. Well, there's a real reason for that. People don't have money in their pockets. People cannot spend money because they're so deeply in debt. And the reason is because they don't belong to a union. That if you have 7% of the people in the private sector organized into unions, then there's no leverage for people to increase wages, and therefore the economy suffers. That's one. The second thing, it is really about just dignity and respect. Nobody should walk into a workplace where they're afraid of their supervisor, where they're threatened by being arbitrarily fired for no reason other than somebody doesn't like you. There's a sense of generally in society that when you spend at least half your waking hours at work, that is a place that you should feel some protection, some dignity, and that comes from having a union.
Labor's power may be at an all-time low, but America still depends on the ranks of blue-collar, middle-class workers to keep things running. And according to Professor Luce, it's a critical time in deciding which direction the country's labor laws will take.
Some people have noted that every tool that workers have and that unions have to win higher wages or benefits has either already been made illegal or is about to be made illegal. But the fact is, workers have never really won anything by following the rules. Most social movements in this country break the laws in order to change the laws.
Wisconsin's Walker is widely viewed as a Republican presidential contender in 2016. And although he hasn't yet officially declared his bid for president, he's frequently heard hinting at what he would do if elected to the White House. For example, he pledged to bring his economic policies to the, quote, other half of America. When asked about how he would deal with the threat of terrorism posed by ISIL, he replied by saying, if I can take on 100,000 protesters, I can do the same around the world. There's no doubt that Scott Walker is very popular among Republicans, but unions and Democrats are already using his own words about anti-union laws against him. 3 years ago, the Wisconsin governor argued that Act 10 would do more than help governments balance budgets. He predicted that it would improve Wisconsin's business climate and advance his pledge to create 250,000 jobs in his 4-year term. But according to federal statistics, Wisconsin has added a net total of just a little over 53,000 jobs since Walker took office. In a piece for the Huffington Post, Harlan Green writes, Walker is destroying Wisconsin's economy. And this man wants to run for president of all 50 states.
It's yet to be seen how unions plan to survive and fight back against their opponents. But one thing almost everyone agrees on is that without a substantial labor movement here in the United States, the middle class will continue to shrink and the concentration of wealth will continue to increase. That's all the time we have for this edition of Inside Out. Thanks so much for staying with us and watching. You can send me your emails to insideout@susanmadaris.com. I'm always looking forward to them. You can also follow me on Twitter for latest updates and discussions. Until next week in another show, goodbye.